So in the last class, we developed our understanding of price elasticity of demand, and we saw how this is a concept that tries to tell us whether the demand for a product is responsive or not to changes in price. And we said that if quantity demanded responds or changes a lot when price changes, then this sort of a sensitive demand is known as elastic demand, and it will always have a PED value of greater than 1. And on the other hand, if the product does not respond, its demand does not respond a lot or does not change a lot when price changes, then this sort of a product will said to have an inelastic, irresponsive demand, and PED will be less than 1. Now in this class, what we want to do is we want to learn how we can just simply, by looking at the shape of the demand curve, how can we tell or predict whether the demand for the product is elastic or inelastic. And what you simply need to remember first of all is that demand curve will always slope downwards. It will be negatively sloped, because demand curve is simply telling you the relationship between price and quantity demanded, and we know that price and quantity will always move in opposite directions. But if your demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, is also very sensitive, that is, quantity doesn't just change in the opposite direction to price, but it changes a lot, then in case of this elastic demand, your demand curve will be very flat like a horizontal line. Whereas if the demand for your product is inelastic, and that is quantity demanded does not change a lot, then for this sort of an inelastic product, the demand curve will be very steep, much more like a straight vertical line, much more steep. Now this is what you need to remember. A flat demand curve means elastic, a steep demand curve means inelastic. Now we will soon see and try to make more sense or understand why that is the case. But first of all, a small trick here, a small easy way of remembering that flat is elastic and steep is inelastic. And that trick is that, remember that inelastic, the word inelastic, it starts with an I. So inelastic. Now if a demand curve is very flat, then it doesn't look like an I. So it's not inelastic, it is, if anything, elastic. Whereas a steeper demand curve now looks much more like an I. This line, steeper line, is much more like an I. So therefore, the more steep your demand curve is, the more like an I your demand curve is, the more inelastic it is. So that's an easy way of reminding yourself that steep means inelastic demand, flat means elastic demand. Now, we can also make more sense of it by just quickly going through a steep and a flat demand curve drawn on the same graph. Now remember, we said flat demand curve means elastic, and we are saying steeper demand curve means inelastic. That will reflect that quantity demanded is not responding a lot to changes in price. Now to see that, start off with this point. This is a point through which both these yellow, the steeper, and white, the flatter demand curves are going through. So this is a point where this price P1, let's say, and quantity Q1. This is a point common to both the demand curves. Now starting from this point, if you increase the price a bit, let's say by this amount, then according to this yellow, steeper, inelastic demand curve, you will only move to the left a bit. That is, given this much of increase in price, quantity demanded will fall just by this small amount. It is not responding a lot. Whereas now, start off with the same price change. So price again starting from this changes almost by the same amount. But if you are looking at this white demand, the flatter demand curve, then given this amount of price change, this vertical height here, the quantity demanded falls quite a lot. You move to the left a lot. So this is where you can already see that the flatter the demand curve is drawn and then you increase the price, the more you have to go to the left. Quantity demanded falls a lot. But if your demand curve is very steep and then you increase the price, then quantity demanded falls just a little bit. So a steeper demand curve means not a responsive demand, inelastic demand. Flatter means a very responsive or an elastic demand. So This is just there, this whole discussion was there for your understanding, but the key is to just remember this thing. Flat means elastic demand, steep means inelastic demand. Now from here we can basically introduce two other interesting cases of elasticity, or extreme cases of elasticity. Now what do I mean by that? Let's start with inelastic. Now, relatively inelastic demand, we are saying, is when the quantity demanded changes, but it does not change a lot due to a given change of price. Inelastic demand. Now, in the extreme case, we can think of a perfectly inelastic demand. Now, what do we mean by perfectly inelastic? If inelastic means not very responsive, then perfectly inelastic means not responsive at all. That is, if a product has perfectly inelastic demand, it means do whatever you want to do with price. Increase it, decrease it by as much as you want, but demand is perfectly inelastic. It will not respond at all. Quantity demanded is going to be what it is. It is not responsive at all. Now, if that is the case, then the demand curve of a perfectly inelastic product will be a straight vertical line. Why? Because we are saying quantity demanded is some value Q star, and it is what it is. It doesn't change with price. If price is P1, Q star is the quantity demanded. If price increases to P2, quantity demanded does not respond at all. It is still Q star, and so on and so forth. P3, quantity demanded is still the same. So a straight vertical demand curve means a perfectly inelastic demand. Now, since perfection doesn't exist in reality, so don't overthink and try to find out an example of a product who has a perfectly inelastic demand. But still, if you want to think about it, then the closest example you can get to is something like life-saving medicine, like a tablet for cancer. Now, this is something that if you are unfortunately a patient of cancer, then you want your 3 tablets of your life-saving cancer tablets that the doctor have prescribed you, and even if those tablets become expensive, you will still somehow buy those 3 tablets. And maybe you will cut back on some other expenses, but you will not reduce the quantity demanded of those tablets since they are expensive. And similarly, if this tablet becomes cheaper, you will not start consuming 6 instead of 3 tablets. So no matter what happens to price, whether it increases or decreases, you will keep on consuming those 3 tablets. Quantity demanded in this case is equal to 3 no matter what the price. It does not respond to changes in price. Perfectly inelastic demand. And then on the other extreme, in the elastic case, sometimes you have a situation of a perfectly elastic demand. So we said that in case of elastic or responsive demand, if you increase the price, quantity demanded falls quite a lot. It's responsive, elastic. Perfectly elastic would imply that if you increase the price, let's say, even a little bit, quantity demanded will suddenly fall extremely largely. That is, quantity demanded will straight away fall down to 0. Perfectly elastic, perfectly responsive. Whereas if you reduce the price, elastic demand tells you that quantity will increase quite significantly, and perfectly elastic means that it will just go through the roof. The quantity demanded, it will not just increase quite a lot, it will increase to infinity. It's perfectly elastic, perfectly responsive. So again, this is unrealistic. We will not try to find real life examples of perfect elasticity, but theoretically we need to know this case, perfect elastic demand. You increase the price and quantity falls down to 0. It responds a lot. In terms of shape of the demand curve, the shape that the demand curve will take in case of perfect elasticity, just remember that elastic demand curve is when it is very flat. A perfectly elastic demand curve is totally flat. It's just a straight horizontal line. That is, the demand curve exists only at some price P star. If you reduce the price a little bit, the demand will increase so much, it will increase to infinity, and we cannot show infinity on a graph. Whereas if you increase the price a little bit, the consumer just runs away. He's too sensitive. The quantity demanded falls to 0. So the only price at which the demand exists is this price P star. perfectly elastic demand. So we have our four main cases here: elastic demand, flat demand curve; inelastic demand, steep demand curve. Perfectly inelastic demand means a very steep, in fact, a straight vertical line, and a perfectly elastic demand means a very horizontal, in fact, a straight horizontal line. And the last case that we cannot forget about is the shape that the demand curve will take if the demand is unitary elastic. Now remember the unitary elastic case. We said that demand responds proportionately to changes in price, and price elasticity of demand is equal to 1. Now if your demand is unitary elastic, then the demand curve takes a very peculiar shape. And we are not going to explain the logic or reason why the demand curve looks the way it does in case of unitary elastic, but we need to know what that particular shape is. And that is a curved hyperbola. Now hyperbola is a curve like this. That's a mathematical term, but you just need to remember that a curve whose middle is pointing towards the origin, that is what a hyperbola is. And if your demand of the product is unitary elastic, its demand curve will be this hyperbola shape. Now make sure you remember this, because this is something that commonly comes up in an MCQ. You are given a demand curve like this and you are asked what is the PED. So you won't need to do any calculations. A hyperbola shape of a demand curve means unitary elastic demand. PED is equal to 1. Moreover, for some of the more complicated questions, also remember that if you start from any point on this demand curve which is reflecting a price elasticity of 1, then at this point, if let's say price is P1 and quantity is Q1, and then you change price to any amount, let's say P2, then the new quantity demanded will be Q2. Now since this hyperbola is telling you that price elasticity of demand is equal to 1, we know that the percentage change of quantity is always going to be equal to the percentage change of price. That is what unitary elastic demand implies. So in this case, as you reduce the price from P1 to P2, as a result, quantity increases from Q1 to Q2. Now unitary elastic demand tells us that this percentage fall in price will be exactly equal to this percentage increase in quantity. That is, if this price fall reflects a percentage fall of 5%, then this quantity increase will equal exactly 5%. So that is your final case, unitary elastic demand.